Hello and welcome to the Of Interest podcast. I'm Gareth Vaughan from interest.co.nz. After 3 years pursuing an aggressive zero-COVID policy, the Chinese government ended the policy abruptly in early December. The move has had major ramifications across a massive country of 1.4 billion people. It also has major international ramifications, of course, given China is the world's second biggest economy and a major player on the international scene. To discuss this, I'm joined by David Mahon. He's our first repeat guest on this podcast. David is the Beijing-based Managing Director of Mahon China Investment Management. Hi, David, and welcome again to the Of Interest podcast.
Hi, Gareth. Thank you for having me back.
Great to have you join us. So look, the end of COVID-0 has clearly been a massive development in China over your winter there. So what was the key catalyst or catalysts for this to happen, and was it a surprise? And how well prepared for this big change were the people of China?
There were two catalysts for the change of policy. One, of course, was the widespread and spontaneous demonstrations against the literal and often really insensitive application of zero COVID policy. So it was a social reaction. It wasn't part of any unified platform. It was actually a more dangerous thing politically, which was it was happening spontaneously in cities and universities and communities that had no real connection with each other. There was no social media links that caused this. Things had gone too far, and there was a major drop in public confidence, and there was a fear, despair, that China was going to maintain this zero COVID policy when to so many people it was clear that omicron was not manageable and containable, and the cost had become socially extremely high. Then you have the economic issue, and the debates in Beijing and amongst China watchers is which was the more important? Was it the social unrest, or was it the fact that she got the numbers for November and saw how truly bad the Chinese economy was, how bad public finances were across the country, and how the system itself, in terms of the public health testing and processing system, was literally running out of financial resources. So I don't know which of those to choose as saying what was the major force, but both were very close to each other in importance. So the government reacted, and this is the problem. Rather than calibrate a process, making sure that there was an understanding of the change, making sure that resources were in place, from one day to the next, from 1 week to the next, of saying, this thing will kill you, stay at home, your government's looking after you. And unlike the rest of the world, we're putting people before economy. They were saying, this is just a flu, people will get sick, but you've all been vaccinated largely, and so it will be all right. And all restrictions were lifted. And they were lifted in an environment of considerable public confusion, and one in which none of the medications that would normally be available, over-the-counter medications for dealing with fevers and the symptoms of a serious flu, were available. Because over the previous 2 years, if you went to buy such things, you had to register as a potential COVID case, and you risked being quarantined. So pharmacies stopped carrying the drugs because they weren't able to sell them. China had plenty of them. China exports 40% of the world's ibuprofen. So people largely went through the peak of Omicron illness without much assistance in an ordinary pharmaceutical sense. So it was a very clumsily conceived and executed lurch out of zero COVID policy. And it has major ramifications in ongoing public confidence.
Yeah, I mean, it obviously came late last year, so early December. I guess as you were heading into the worst of your winter weather there in China, And obviously, you've also just had your Lunar New Year or Spring Festival celebrations where people have been allowed to travel for the first time in, I guess, 3 years for that. So there's been a lot of movement around China in the certainly last month or two. So, I mean, how significantly has the virus spread? And I mean, have you personally managed to avoid catching it to date? And how, are you getting data on case numbers and illnesses and deaths and anything else like that?
Yes, well, I think the peak of illness occurred before the Chinese New Year. The speed at which Omicron spread or impacted upon the communities, the cities where it was already present, but people began to commingle again and move and, of course, got sick. No one knows really what the numbers were because China stopped testing. So any numbers are speculative. I mean, up until the eve of Chinese New Year, I was on the road 2 weeks in Henan province, Shanghai, then in Yunnan, visiting small intermediate cities, largely at pursuing horticultural clients' interests. And then since the Chinese New Year ended, I have been on the road constantly. Again, I was in Shanghai and then in the southwest of China. There didn't seem to be any major issue post-Chinese New Year in any sort of extraordinary impact with hospitals being overloaded to the point where they wouldn't cope, or a death toll that seemed to be uncommon or a counter to the same experiences that other societies have gone through when they released COVID restrictions, because we're dealing with variants that are very similar to those that New Zealand faced when it came out of its restrictions. So I think it's too early to really say how many people got seriously ill. And the death toll is being obscured because anyone who dies, if there's something else they could have died of, or there was some comorbidity, it is the comorbidity that is focused on, not Omicron or COVID itself. And this we have had some success in, or I would say we've had a few breaks in getting information, only in that there are friends of ours, people on our network who have relatives involved in managing hospitals at a senior level in cities. And a lot of old people have died here. There's no question. And I don't know how that will compare. But most deaths were for people who had other illnesses or were very old. We're not hearing of anything that is counter to the patterns globally in terms of people who are much younger, people that seem to have no other real symptoms but catch COVID and get ill. So I think while the death toll amongst the elderly has been considerable, I think that in general the society probably has not been through any more of a wave of illness than most other countries at the same stage. That's how it looks. But it's very hard to say. We're only guessing because there hasn't been enough testing and there isn't the data. When it comes to the attitude of people, there's a sort of black humor that everyone on the streets you see has had COVID, and any lack of traffic or absentees, it's because people are either trying to avoid it or are in the process of getting through it. And certainly a great number of people have had COVID. I'm surprised at everyone in our business has had COVID. All the family members from middle age and upward have been through it in some form. Some of the children, but none of them very severely. There have been 3 deaths in our small team in terms of grandparents. But overall, most people have reported, as they did in New Zealand or Australia or other countries that are more easier to assess given their scale. There's enough people, but the populations are still small enough to measure in some way. Effectively, it was somewhat similar. The thing that surprised me was much of my time has been spent in the last 3 weeks, absent the 8-day period of Chinese New Year, in country areas. in mountainous areas of Yunnan, in the counties around the city of Nanyang and Henan City. And these are relatively remote places. There hasn't been any reports of great deal of illness. And I stayed in some villages over weekends, just on my own accord, talking to people, trying to get a sense of things. And I found that in general, there was quite a sanguine attitude towards COVID, especially in the more remote areas. It seemed people had been getting sick, but I think the immune systems of rural people in China is very good. I don't think it's the same in the cities. Chinese people tend to go to hospitals because there isn't the GP system here. When they get a flu or they get a cold, invariably they're given antibiotics. Often they're over-medicated. They'll go on an antibiotic drip for a common cold. And so I think that the immune systems of urban people are a lot weaker than those in the countryside. Because the areas I've been traveling in, it doesn't seem to have been a major impact. And the agricultural activities have continued. In many parts of the southwest, we're coming into a harvest period. There doesn't seem to have been any diminution of the planting and tending of crops. So I think in general, you could say that the Chinese countryside has come through this pretty well. The cities have been hit pretty hard, but the peak has passed. We're now moving into a genuine post-COVID era.
It's interesting, David, when we spoke last August, you had been travelling as well just before that interview, and obviously then in the zero COVID world. So I think you'd been in an area where there had been a COVID outbreak and you'd had to go back to your apartment in Beijing and isolate for a week, even though you were some distance from the outbreak. So obviously the ease of mobility in your recent travels will have been welcome for you. It's interesting insight into how the people are sort of dealing with it. Because one of the things I was going to ask was, I know from our own experience in New Zealand when we shifted to the living with the virus phase, I mean, we obviously had tight restrictions here, albeit not quite like China, but it can be a big mental change even when you're quite keen to move on. So people seem to be adjusting to the end of COVID zero reasonably well.
It's hard to say how people adjust to what has been an enduring trauma. It would be presumptuous to start saying, well, the Chinese people are going through this or that. I think the trauma of COVID has been considerable. I think it's been probably higher here than in other countries because the government overplayed it. They wanted compliance because they wanted to save lives. There's no question that the motive in locking China down and all the things that were undertaken were done because they wanted to save lives. And they did put people before economic interests in many cases. But in the way that the central government, the way perhaps the interpretation of central government edicts is at a local level, they really overplayed things so people would stay home, they would test regularly, of course wear masks all the time. And so I think the fear of the pandemic there was an investment in the fear of the pandemic to perhaps a higher degree than there have been in other countries. And this is something still for China to come through. I mean, this is somewhat of a country that has a phobia of illness, slightly differently than other countries because there is a history. In living memory, there is a history of the impact of pandemics, of failures of public health systems. This is still largely a developing country. I mean, we keep comparing China in our minds to the images of a Shanghai or Beijing or a Shenzhen. Much of China 60% of China is still nothing like that. It's third, fourth tier cities, it's rural areas. And the resources are not those of the, say, 11 coastal provinces. These are backward areas. These are places where the tax revenues aren't that high, local governments don't have that much money, so all resources are somewhat minimal. So you've got a population struggling in a system where there isn't a lot of means to actually service their needs in an extreme situation like this. And they remember back, perhaps to their childhood, if they're over 50, or to the stories they've heard, where major illnesses would sweep through China, and the toll on the communities were considerable. Although China did very well in eradicating many diseases, it was still vulnerable. And I think the problem is that the over-concern for one's individual health is something that has been always part of a society with such a history. You think of the famines, revolutions, all these things contribute to the state of mind, something that would be inconceivable to people in developed countries. A European, someone in the Netherlands, someone in Scandinavia, or certainly Australasia. If you begin to think how people approach such things as public health or individual wellness, it's quite a different scenario. So I think China has to come some distance still to get away from the fear of this virus, the fear it may return. I'm sure that when we get into the autumn, there'll be a considerable concern amongst a lot of people. Nonetheless, China has come through this reasonably well. People are back to work with real energy. So they might be a little nervous. They will wear masks, of course, on public transport, which I think is sensible anyway. And they will wear them in the streets to quite a point. You know, it's quite odd to walk through a village and you pass someone, the only person in that street, and they've got a mask on. You sort of wonder why they would do that in a country area, but nevertheless they do. But people are working. People are very keen to be back at work. Production has kicked in. The Chinese economy is beginning to really move again. So from that measure, people have gone back to what they now perceive as a normality. And the hangover is still there. The biggest concern the government has is not so much the concern for illness or a nervousness or some delayed trauma of the lockdown months that many cities suffered. It's actually the perception that this administration, the communities in which people live, in a time of crisis, were failed by their leaders. And that is the perception in many parts of China. They knew that the lockdowns were too extreme. They knew that the sealing off of buildings, where hundreds and hundreds of people were contained for weeks on end because a couple of people had tested positive, weren't even sick with COVID, has confounded the common sense. And this is a very practical country. It's a country where most people look at things from a very common sense point of view. But they've been failed, and that this was a government that was overreacting itself. It wasn't quite clear what it was doing, and therefore it put people into a very, very difficult situation, economically, psychologically, and dealing with their families and caring for their loved ones. So this is something that the government needs to deal with going forward. It has squandered precious political currency that it had built, and Xi Jinping certainly had built over the last 10 years. At many local levels, this has been squandered and will need to be re-earned in terms of getting back public confidence. And another way, I think it's quite a positive thing that in an authoritarian country like China, there is more questioning. There is more challenging from the general population, not in terms of protests and civil disobedience, but an attitude of show me the facts here. Tell me why this is something I should comply with. And I think that is going to have a mitigating factor on the level of controls that have been in place in China in the last 5 years and certainly over COVID. So these are all the seeds of how Chinese society will change in the future. And I think some of those have been sown by what's taken place in these COVID years.
That's fascinating, David. It's going to be very interesting to watch how things evolve in coming years. You're talking about the economy there, and from what you're saying, and I guess from what I've been reading as well, it does sound like that the Chinese economy is experiencing a reopening bounce, if you like. How are the particular sectors looking? I mean, I guess in terms of the big themes, manufacturing, services, and domestic consumption.
I think domestic consumption has been the focus of most commentators and economists, for good reason. But I see that consumption is a product of something else. I'm more interested in production, in innovation. Those are the measurements which are more important, because consumption is the end result of Chinese businesses producing products and services that people want, accurately reading consumer demand and meeting it. And innovation, of course, is critical, because you want new services, you want new e-commerce facilitations, you want better products for the food and beverage sector, you want better household appliances. There's so many things which make a big difference to the level of consumption here. And although consumption has been on the rise very steadily in the last 12 years, and it's now fair to say that consumption and services are two of the major drivers of the Chinese economy, in the end, consumption is still somewhat behind where it should be for an economy of this level of development, and certainly an economy of this domestic dynamic. China is different than the rest of the world. This is a cohort of 1.4 billion people with the same regulatory systems, the same language, the same currency. I mean, there is no other economy, either in history or of current comparable scale, to measure against China. It's just unique. China has its own economic cycles, not completely separate from the rest of the world, but to some degree offset from the cycles that the West goes through economically, through recessions, through boom times and growth times. So this is an economy that is essentially domestically driven. We must not look at the export issues, the trade account, which have been so helpful to China in the last 3 years. Right now, that's not the most important thing, which unfortunately many commentators are looking very hard at China's exports and saying, well, China's economy is looking a bit weak because it's not exporting what it used to. Well, exports don't really contribute to GDP growth if you look at the last 8 to 10 years significantly. It is domestic consumption. Consumption is returning. I think there is a coming spike of the pent-up demand of people that have not been able to buy a new car, refurbish their apartment, or buy another property. People who've been wishing to go on holiday, certainly domestically, but increasingly internationally. All these things that have been delayed are now being spent on, consumed. So this will be a good year. I think we'll end up with certainly in excess of 4% GDP growth. Some are predicting 5 and above. I don't think that's unrealistic. But in that growth that China will enjoy, there'll be a pent-up demand being spent that will then even out, and the demand will not be as strong because people would have made those big choices that they've delayed. Then there will be the government intervention. And although the subsidization of this economy, the stimulus that's being applied is far less than what was applied after the global financial crisis, for example, and certainly by ratio, far less than in many even developed so-called more free market economies globally. China has allowed this downturn in its economy to break over the country, using where it can funds to maintain ability of employers to pay salaries, to keep key sectors going. But now it's very much leaving things to market forces in the general commercial world. But around that, there are some things that will not be distortions for this year, but uncommon factors. That is that China will try and help rebuild the municipal finances, the provincial finances that have been so damaged by the zero COVID policies of the last few years. And so there will be more stimulus projects that are needed, but undertaken probably earlier than considered. Banks are being told to take a looser approach to their credit policies. against, again, a lot of commentary that this is a state-owned, dominated economy. 90% of China's economy is driven by private sector companies. Yes, they have interactions with key state-owned shareholders in many sectors. It is still probably more of a free market economy than many Western economies today. But around the edges of that, there is a fair amount of stimulus and support. Tax breaks for companies, loans suspended in terms of obligations of paying back principal, as long as interest is met. All these things are facilitating the recovery of companies, particularly in the private sector. So I think this is positive. I think this is sensible economics. But it will create a year of relative strength that the following year may not reflect in the same way, because there are still some fundamental changes that China needs to undertake in its economy. One of the key areas of focus is the property sector. And quite rightfully, this has been arguably 1/5, even 1/4 of the driver of the Chinese domestic economy in previous years. This is going back from beginning of 2020 and before. I think in that area, we're not seeing the collapse that many have forecast. The collapse that would be driven because Chinese consumers were too nervous to invest heavily, make a major capital commitment because they weren't sure of government policy, or they were concerned that prices would fall further, so that the market in many of the major cities hadn't bottomed out yet. I think that there will be a mild recovery in property. And once this momentum and prices begin to rise again, that will increase in pace. So I think the property sector will be okay this year, but it won't be as strong as it would have been in a more normal pre-COVID year.
Now, last October, there was obviously the 20th National Congress of the Communist Party in Beijing, and President Xi Jinping, as expected, secured an unprecedented third term as China's top leader, with a Politburo that's now seen as dominated by his allies. Just wondering, have there been any noticeable changes stemming from that so far?
It's very hard to tell. Anyone who gives opinions on what's happening in the core of the Chinese Communist Party is at best talking from a deep understanding of party history, serving a level of perhaps reasonable speculation. Beyond that, it's very hard to say. So normally when changes have been mooted, which is what happened in the 20th Party Congress, and some positions that we thought were absolute certainty, the people we thought were going into those but didn't go into those positions. We thought Yi Yong was going to head the People's Bank of China. Instead, he became mayor of Beijing, and that was something that we got wrong. But there are some things you can see in principle. I have a theory, it's only a theory, but the reversal of COVID policy was that the new team was already talking to Xi, and they're a different generation than the outgoing, many of the outgoing senior ministers and some of the Politburo members and other key figures in the Chinese administration. And they brought perhaps a better educated, more science-based, more worldly view of things. And this was what helped Xi change his mind on the policy. That's my theory. I look at the age, experience. I look at the track record within the last sort of 10 years of their operations within the Chinese government and party systems. This is a highly experienced group of people. They are only in the positions they're in largely through merit of performing extremely well on all fronts, particularly on economic management. So, yes, it's a team loyal to Xi, like any politician or any leader. You look at any big company, someone comes in as CEO to a large business, they will bring around them as many loyal people as they can find. Because in any dynamic political environment, you want people you can rely on. people you can trust that you can listen to. So that's normal. What's problematical about the current structure is that in an environment such as this, there will probably be fewer dissenting voices for Xi to listen to, because the people that there have been loyal to him, they're aligned with him, in many of them in ideological terms, but certainly in social management and economic terms. So ultimately, he may be listening as time goes on to hearing fewer and fewer voices that are different. So while some of the advice will be better in some core economic and commercial areas, in other areas it may not be as varied as a leader of with the level of responsibility that Xi has. So I'm speculating that in some ways, after the 20th Party Congress, contrary to a lot of commentators, we saw economic objectives and potential changes as hugely positive for a more open economy, open to the world and open within itself. We saw a setback in terms of the party and government trend, where greater plurality, an environment where more voices are heard, there is room for more dissent, where people outside the systems, people in think tanks, universities, business leaders can have voices that are heard more. That has gone backwards. And I think this is something which is going to be an issue in the next 2 to 3 years in terms of this government. But I think for business and for the economy in general, we will see quite a considerable improvement, a one-pointedness to a positive degree in terms of growth and change. So it's an odd situation. We're in perhaps a politically more constrained and slightly more reminiscent of eras in the past in China, but in an economy that's going to be perhaps, I think, more market forces driven and more open to the global economy than it was in the past. So there's a weird dichotomy coming out of this 20th Party Congress.
Now, looking sort of internationally, there's obviously been an issue in the news in the last week between China and the US in relation to a Chinese balloon that drifted over US airspace that the Americans believed was a spy balloon and the Chinese said was an off-course weather balloon. Now, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has called off a trip to China, or at least postponed it because of this incident. I'm just wondering, what's your overview of how China's relationship with the US is at the moment? And what's the sort of general view in Beijing of the relationship with the US at the moment?
The relationship with the US is bad and getting worse, and there is no indication that will change. Both Washington and Beijing are in an intractable and rather peevish position. The fact that Blinken's trip did not take place shows how bad the relationship is. When something like this balloon, which is alleged to be on the Chinese side a weather balloon, alleged on the American side a form of surveillance, a spy balloon, the fact that this balloon was carrying a chamber under it, the size of the All Black tour bus, kind of begs a few questions that it probably wasn't a weather balloon, and there was more likely to be some form of spy system. Both countries are spying on each other all the time. I mean, we can't be shocked by this as something that we could not have anticipated. We are in a state of relative Cold War between China and the US, certainly in American economic policy and sanctions, on technology out of China. It's what you do in a war footing. I mean, there's no other word for it. In terms of the positioning in North Asia of American military and incredibly intense work being done in Southeast Asia to win allies, to reinforce and existing allies and to those that are perhaps wavering, to bring them to the US side. A lot of energy is being put into that. So this is a very tense situation. And the balloon, we'll forget about it quite quickly, but it is an example of both large powers are putting a lot of effort into spying on each other. And the trouble is that for both countries is that now this is public. I'm sure that the Pentagon would have rather that this was something that they had known about and kept to themselves. Now everyone has to deal with it. But when something like this happens in a reasonable environment, foreign ministers, effectively Blinken's role, they meet even more determinedly because they want to resolve an issue. But in this case, Washington has decided that the visit will not take place. And it's possible some months will pass. We may not get till the summer before there is a major visit. So things are pretty bad. I think if China could find itself in some real discussion forum, if there was a real intent on the part of Washington to resolve differences, and find some level of rapprochement, I think China would seize that. The last thing they want is this level of conflict. But China hasn't managed to find a way to respond to the pressures that it's come under, the containment which America's trying to enforce on it. So in that sense, China's not been very skilled diplomatically, and it's created a situation that is probably worse than it should be. But without question, America is determined to contain China, to restrict its evolution as an economy, simply out of an imperial competition. This is not about human rights. This is not about some established world order of law and standards. All those things are complete red herrings. I mean, America doesn't follow any restraints on human rights when it feels it's acting in its national interest. Hence the invasion of Iraq, of Afghanistan, its drones flying over a whole array of countries in the Middle East, violating other people's airspace. It says that it's doing those things in the interest of a global order. It's doing those things in the interests of an American order. So we have a long, very difficult group of years ahead, maybe even 5 or more, where China will be struggling against the containment that America is trying to mete out to it and pressure its former allies and trade partners to join it in containing. So New Zealand's been under tremendous pressure on this front. I actually have a lot of, I would give Jacinda Ardern tremendous credit for the line that she walked on speaking out on things that concerned New Zealand, but maintaining an independent voice and not just echoing Canberra and Washington. And in that way, she follows the traditions of John Key and Helen Clark, who were very skilled in difficult times in doing the same. So, for New Zealand, this is a very difficult thing to manage politically, and great credit should go to our government in handling it. I think if we have a change of government next year, I would expect a similar level of subtlety and balance. I think it's now perhaps deeper in our national consciousness, that political consciousness, that we need to be an independent player in the world, not just with China, but with any issue, because we're such a small country with such little political leverage. So things are difficult. Beijing and Washington will go on speaking against each other. The issue of Taiwan will be used by the US as much as it can. I think it's a distraction. I don't see any imminent invasion of Taiwan. It's in no one's interests, and Beijing isn't stupid. I think America doesn't want a conflict over Taiwan either, but it wants to get to a high level of tension because it thinks that will actually keep pressure on China. But accidents happen. There could be some naval accident in the South China Sea. Fighter jets might have some issue, even on the edges of Australian airspace. Anything like this is possible. So we have some very difficult years to come. So any optimism, which currently one does hear around the relationship with Beijing and Canberra, I think that's a little rose-tinted spectacles. Politically, I don't see a lot of chances of a real settling down of that Australian-China relationship or deep improvement. What I do see, though, is that Australian companies, like New Zealand companies, are actually coming back into China with quite a lot of determination and energy. And I think the commercial cultures of our country and of Australia and of the US too will continue to make the best they can of the Chinese market. At a political level, though, I think things will be pretty negative.
Another major international issue, of course, over the past year now has been Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, obviously, in February last year, not long before the invasion, Vladimir Putin was in Beijing at the Winter Olympics and meeting President Xi. Now, they issued a statement out of that highlighting the friendship between the two countries, and obviously Russia has been China's largest supplier of crude oil in recent times, and obviously Russia's faced a Western embargo on that front. How is China's relationship with Russia holding up as, I guess, the war in Ukraine goes on, and the outcome of it appears very uncertain?
Publicly, Beijing will always, in this particular era or period, refrain from condemning the war in Ukraine. Publicly, China will show solidarity with Russia, not with the war, but with Russia as a country. Because its enemy, America, is currently embroiled in this war through its support of Ukraine. And from a realpolitik perspective, it's in China's interest that there is somewhat of a distraction on the part of the US and NATO that otherwise would be focused more on China and more effort will be made to contain China. So that's a benefit that China gets from the war in Ukraine. There is no other benefit. I do have friends in reasonably high positions here. Again, I don't know ministers. I don't have contacts, at a level that I can be absolutely sure of the thinking. But a range of friends involved enough have said the fury in the Chinese administration over the fact that Russia, one, initiated the war, and the fact that it's gone on as long as it has is considerable. So internally, Beijing has very little time for Moscow's actions because it is costing it economically. It's costing the global economy economically. Instability is in no one's interest. And the most important trading partner that China has is Europe. Cross-border investment between Europe and China and trade is 2.5 times the size of that between China and the US. And this major trading partner, the partner that gives a chance of a counterpoint to US influence, is embroiled in this mess in Europe because of the war in Ukraine. So any idea that there's some kind of authoritarian brotherhood over snatching countries and violating territory is a bit of a fantasy. China was the first country in the world to recognize an independent Ukraine 30 years ago. Historically, no country's taken more territory from China than Russia. Mongolia is an example. Parts of what were Xinjiang. Russia going into the next decade is potentially one of China's biggest problems. In Central Asia, China has extensive economic interests, but almost no security presence. Russia has a considerable security presence throughout Central Asia and the former stans that were part of the Soviet Union. And they're faltering because of the failure in Ukraine to date. There's now stirrings in Central Asia that maybe Russia is not some guarantor of security, or perhaps their voice is not to be listened to as much as it was in the past. All these things are destabilizing to an area, a region that China depends on to quite an extent. So we've got to be careful of what we see as the public rhetoric. Do we say because the US has a close relationship with Saudi Arabia that defines US political culture and society? It's a relationship of expedience. Saudi Arabia is a country that is engaged in some horrific violations of human rights. But for reasons of resource needs on the part of the US, it's always the place where the new president goes to first. So I think externally there is a certain series of indications, but internally China needs this war to end. It needs the tariffs and embargoes to be lifted. In some ways they're having more damage to countries outside of Russia and those imposing them than really to Russia itself. The Russian economy will probably grow this year because of resource prices. So it's an odd situation, but I think to say for a moment that there's any real solidarity with Russia over Ukraine, China is not in that position. It might have accepted the annexation of Ukraine if it had happened as swiftly as of the Crimea. Again, just from a point of expedience. But China's looking at its own borders, and it's looking at the number of countries with which it has difficult relationships with on its borders. Amongst those, of course, there is India, where there's a lot of tension, and there are even conflicts at times. It has, despite its good trade relations, uneasy relationships with countries like Kyrgyzstan, where because of the relative repression of Uyghurs in some parts of Xinjiang, it's caused problems with the neighboring Muslim countries. So China's, despite, again, what people think, North Korea is a major problem for China. Very little communication, a lot of tension. China's appalled at the state of North Korea and its pursuit of military prowess in the region. So it looks at all these things, and it doesn't like the idea of a country going into another country and staking some historical claim because it feels its own vulnerabilities on its own borders. So I think it's an interesting dynamic. I think it's one that whenever this war does end, and I think it will probably go on for some time, there'll be more internally strained relationships with Moscow than unity. And that's just the normal state of play. Going forward, Russia is the one country China probably will trust the least when it comes to its own near regional interests.
Look, David, that's fascinating. It's really interesting to hear about what has been going on in China over the past couple of months as COVID-0 ended, and indeed the perspective on the international scene coming out of China at the moment. That is David Mahon, who is the Beijing-based Managing Director of Mahon China Investment Management. And I'm Gareth Vaughan from interest.co.nz with another episode of our Of Interest podcast.